The first time I saw him was over 3 years ago. He was part of a crowd on a subway that I saw as I sat leaving on the train. At first, I could only make out the abstract expression, his details being too far away to clearly register. It was clear from this singular observation, however, that something was horribly wrong. His face was twisted into an excessive grin, one that failed to imply true enthusiasm or happiness, but instead was glaringly artificial, as if to deliberately catch a close observer off guard, to reel them in. His face stretched impossibly wide, his eyes wincing, and looking as if they were subtly attempting to hide a malevolent intent. His face disturbed me, but I assumed it was a simple aberration at first. However, the man continued to look at me, glaring his grotesque smile. Each time I rode, he seemed to grow closer to the train, until he was eventually standing so close to the tracks that he could nearly be run over. However, everyone there seemed not to care. It wasn't as if he didn't exist. They still made the small interactions every average person does, but they showed no fear in his expressions or in his dangerous actions. This continued for over a year until he began to appear inside the train itself. I can remember the first day clearly. I saw him seat himself, doing so with a sitting posture that was just unnatural, completely turned at 90-degree angles and unrelaxed. He was on the other side and half a dozen seats away, but I could make out his face with ease now. He looked both far too young and far too old. I could have honestly said that he was either 20 or 60. That's how hard it was to tell. Sitting closer, I could perceive his grin and the almost apparent pain he seemed to feel with his unnatural smile and deranged, bloodshot eyes. His face was tightly wrinkled, not naturally, but as the result of how far his face was being stretched. He could have probably been considered conventionally attractive if he were making normal facial expressions. But he had twisted himself into one of the most hideous specimens of human being I have ever seen. His hair was brown, slightly receded, but long and curly and parted in the middle. His legs were abnormally short, and he could barely touch the floor in the seat he was in. I tried to look away again, but he continued to draw my attention. I could tell he was staring at me, but I didn't wish to break the peace on the train ride. He looked gleeful at my immense discomfort, and I swore I could see his neck leering slightly forwards. The charade continued, as he would continue to sit in different random places, but always with the same unnatural posture and the same retina-burning face. I began considering the sheer unlikelihood of us both attending the exact same car at the exact same time. I worried he had followed me at first, but in many cases, he had already seated himself wherever he was, and I would only notice a few minutes afterwards. Although, I always noticed. Even when I tried to walk the 3-mile hike to work, I would see him in a crowd, or in a taxi, or in a restaurant, never having ordered any food, but always sitting at a table, with a view of the outside, staring at me. His presence had grown from unsettling to downright predatory. I attempted to charge into the restaurant at one point and beg him to stop, but when I went over to his table, he was simply gone, and no one had ever reported seeing him or anyone who resembled him in the establishment. I'd looked through thousands of files in the city's registry, but nobody's faces appeared to line up with his. I had abandoned all hope of discovering his intentions when something happened that would cause things to become drastically worse. I had been forced to work the late shift at my job, and by the time I was done, it was nearly midnight. The metro at this point was nearly empty, and when I got onto the train, I was the only person to enter my cart. As I sat down, I heard the thin breaths of something inhuman, and gradually turned to another person, looking in a different direction, who was nearly 2 seats away from me. Dread began to settle in my stomach, as their face slowly, mechanically turned to confirm what I had subconsciously known already. I was no more than 5 feet away from the man that had tormented my mind for years, every inch and detail of his face clearly visible. So close to the man I could tell he couldn't be human. His skin was too unnatural, too rubbery, his teeth lacking the grit or reflectiveness of a person, but instead completely bland and nearly plastic. I jumped out of my seat screaming, but no one could hear me in the other cars as we traveled deep under the metro. As I began to back away, the man just sat there, with the same malevolent grin washed upon his face. I could only meagerly eke out a few words. Why are you doing this? He took nearly a dozen seconds for any response, only for his mouth to open, exposing his completely black throat. He had no tongue, uvula, or flesh, only complete and utter blackness, expanding down the infinite expanse of his inner mouth. A harsh, breathy moan responded. At a labored pace, I screamed at him for more answers, but he could only continue the desperate charade. Escaped his lips, or what posed as lips yet again, stabbing at any hopes I had whatsoever for a coherent answer. I swung my fist as hard as I could at him, yet he was absolutely unaffected. I began punching him over and over again, with extreme force, lunging at him and attacking his stomach and groin for some type of response, but nothing happened. The attacks reflected off his overly shiny skin, leaving absolutely no indentation or notice of attack. I could see now that even his clothes didn't budge, as if they were completely fused to his skin. As I screamed at the top of my lungs again, I heard him finally whisper another word. It was just as useless, just as meaningless, cruel, and arbitrary. I flung myself outside the metro as soon as I could, and ran as fast as I have ever run in my entire life, nearly toppling another person. I ran up the stairs to my apartment and locked it absolutely shut. I began to hear a low, dulcet tone. A continuous whisper, like a movie version of a snake. As I shone my phone's flashlight across my apartment, I saw what I swore to God couldn't have been. He had somehow beat me to my own apartment and was standing in my living room. The exact center of my apartment, staring at me. As I walked, his body perfectly rotated, not even shuffling his legs, but rotating without any external movements. I ran to the apartment door, trying to force it open, but it refused to budge. I could see he was slowly approaching me, so I jumped and kicked him directly in the face, running to my bedroom and slamming my door and locking it as he began standing up as if nothing had happened. I rammed my wardrobe over the door and called 911 as fast as I could. The police arrived 2 hours later, breaking down my apartment door, but immediately afterwards, I heard the low rattling of multiple death gurgles. I looked outside my bedroom's peephole to see the man standing over the collapsed bodies of the emergency force of over half a dozen men that had been sent in. He continued to stare at me, again continuing as a monotonous, dread-inducing drone. Within 30 minutes, I could hear the sounds of my door being fiddled with, looking outside the peephole to see his face staring at me in a greater expression of hate than I had ever seen, the hissing noise transforming painfully slowly into a distorted gurgle. I can tell he's close to opening my bedroom door now. My best bet is likely to jump outside my window and hope I can survive the 3-story fall. Almost wordlessly, I realized something. He wanted me to do this. By sharing this with you, I've invited the man's form into your head. Stop reading this story now, and stop thinking about him forever. It's the only way you can possibly stay safe. I dearly regret exposing you to this thing and whatever it has planned for you and I, but it's too late now. I've attempted to delete this story dozens of times, but my fingers force me to bear my thoughts onto the page and bear his form. He forced me to take a picture of his form. And as I speak now, my body is forcing me to post the link. Please do not click on it, no matter what you do.